there are very severe strains in the Russian economy, plummeting of the ruble recently, all sorts of issues with their foreign exchange now. A lot of people predicting that, in the middle of next year, the Russian economy will just basically tank, run out of money for federal spending.
Now, Mark Urban is here, as he is every Monday, to talk us through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. Welcome back, Mark.
It's a pleasure to be here, as always, Laura.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about Syria first, because the UK has had diplomatic contact with the rebel group that toppled Assad's regime. David Lammy has said that. Do we know what kind of things diplomatic contact would actually likely mean?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And you might argue, well, what's the problem? They are the new government. So let's crack on and get talking, because there's lots of things to talk about, from, humanitarian to reconstruction and all the rest of it. But the issue is that the government is led by this group HTS, and for many years they were on the terrorist list, as it were. They were a proscribed organization that I think they still technically are in this country. And their leader, for example, is still subject to a $10 million bounty from the United States. So that's why it's not so straightforward. And if you are a Foreign Office or State Department official sent to Damascus, you might ask that question. Are you asking me to do something illegal, to have this conversation that you'd like me to have with some of the new people who are in charge of Syria? So that's why it's not quite as straightforward as it might seem. But it would seem that pragmatism has reigned, and the foreign players have been more or less queuing up, trying to get in. So we know the Turks went to see them. The foreign minister and the head of their intelligence service went to see the key players in Damascus last Wednesday. We know the Russians also had some kind of involvement there, trying to extend their use of those key bases. And then we know at the weekend that the Americans said they'd had contact. And now, finally, we heard yesterday from David Lammy that the British have also had contact. We don't know exactly whether that was, for example, an official from a nearby embassy. Beirut would be the obvious place to travel in from. Sometimes these contacts, particularly with people who are on that list of prescribed organizations, might be conducted by intelligence people, MI6 in this context. But I think we await further detail on exactly who it was who went to press the flesh in Damascus yesterday, if that's indeed when it was.
It's very interesting because obviously in the days after Assad's regime fell, there was a conversation here in Westminster about deprescribing potentially HTS. But clearly it seems, like you say, that pragmatically perhaps the strictures aren't quite so restrictive when it comes to what you can and can't do with organisations like HTS.
Yeah, I mean, as I kind of hinted at the end there, the way that historically countries like the UK and the US have squared the circle here is to use their intelligence people to conduct those kinds of contacts. One thinks back to some of the early attempts to negotiate ceasefires in Northern Ireland, for example, being done by people from MI6. With representatives of Sinn Féin, that kind of thing. And the US has a long history of it in the Middle East, of engaging with all sorts of people who American political leaders denounce as, terrorists and all the rest. Now, clearly, what we're talking about in those kind of instances is using the innate secrecy of those people who work for those agencies to avoid awkward questions. Because, of course, as you know, in Westminster, if someone were to start asking questions about whether a certain official from that organisation, MI6, had been in there, then you'd either get the government just not taking the question, or they'd say, well, it's our long-standing practice not to comment on intelligence matters. So in other words, you use those kinds of agencies to square the circle between who you say you'll talk to and who actually sometimes you either have to, for example, to get hostages out, or you want to, in this case, to try and contribute in some meaningful way towards stabilizing free Syria.
That's really interesting. And you wrote yesterday in the Sunday Times about the role of Turkey in the conflict, and why it's been seen so far, at least, and maybe just tentatively, as a big victory for Erdogan.
Well, indeed, Erdogan. I mean, this is all part of his shtick. Obviously, he's been leader for a long time, and many Turks still support him. I know people in some Western countries don't particularly admire him, but the truth is, one of the ways that he has always exercised political power is to portray himself as the kind of master strategist and the guy who really can get some good results for Turkey out of some often rather chaotic regional political and military realities. Now, the Turks briefed out pretty soon. This was a couple of weeks ago after HTS and their Turkish allies, which is a group called the Syrian National Army, and basically Syrians paid by Turkish military intelligence. After they took Aleppo, the Turks were quick to say, "Well, this, we had a hand in this," and that kind of thing, and quick to say that basically they had given the green light, and that on a previous occasion, a few months earlier, when HTS wanted to do this, that the Turks had held them back for their own reasons, their own regional security and political reasons. Now, of course, what's happened now is that the thing has succeeded beyond the wildest expectations, presumably of HTS, and slightly out of control of Erdogan, because the line that was coming out of Ankara, the Turkish capital, after the initial taking of Aleppo, was that he wanted to create a bigger sort of secure zone in northern Syria for lots of different Turkish national reasons, but including trying to encourage the 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey to go back across the border. And then, of course, suddenly he was in this situation where he said, or the briefings were saying, he didn't want to overthrow Assad. He just had this limited aim. Well, now, of course, Assad's been overthrown. There are lots of opportunities there for Turkey in the sense that he has been trying for many years to bulldoze the Kurdish opposition, the people who've been staging attacks inside Turkey from over the border in Syria. He's been trying to bulldoze them out the way, suppress those Kurdish groups. And there are 10,000 Turkish troops, for example, in Syria, and have been for years. And so this is an opportunity for him to do that. It's also an opportunity to move against the Islamic State, which is in a similar area of Syria, just south of the Kurds and somewhat to the east generally, northeast Turkey, northeast Syria, I beg your pardon. And so there's a certain amount of Turkey, America, and one or two other regional actors, Jordan, all finding common cause in saying, well, the priority now is to suppress Islamic State. The priority for Turkey is also to suppress the Kurds, and he wants to kind of leverage that for his own national advantage. But where this goes longer term, if Syria doesn't become a tranquil, stable place in which everyone's focusing on reconstruction and hopefully using Turkish companies to do it, if it becomes more anarchic, more like the Libyan situation or what happened in Iraq after 2003, then there could be all sorts of problems for Turkey as well.
And just to add to that mix of foreign powers, it's been viewed as a disaster publicly for Iran. Is it fair to say that Iran is now completely out of the picture, do you think?
Well, I think one of the things the leadership of HTS have said is that they favor a sort of federal form of government in Syria, the new Syria. In other words, they're prepared to give quite a lot of autonomy to people like the Kurds in order to get them to be loyal to the government in Damascus, pass on their taxes, and all the rest of it. If you have a sort of rather loose system of power, I think that the chances are that all of the regional players, Turkey, whose military intelligence service has been very active in the north of Syria, as I've said, for the past 10 years, Iran, Israel, they will all be trying to exploit that relatively loose or weak central power, having had a period in which there was a sort of crushing form of dictatorship and power from the center. I think we can expect them to try and exploit that. Now, from the Iranian point of view, the prize, if they can do it, is to continue covertly doing what they've been doing for years with the agreement of the Assad government, which is across the highways of Syria and through Damascus airport, providing weapons to their allies in Lebanon, Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militia group. At the moment, the Iranians have been quite candid and said, well, that's it now. The supply line is broken. Uh, the HTS people, being Sunnis who were often fighting Hezbollah during the Syrian civil war, are not going to do anything to make that easier for Iran and Hezbollah. They bear a considerable grudge against them. But does Iran try to exploit limited central government authority, or what indeed may become a more chaotic situation if things don't go well, to carry on with that? I think we can expect them to try and act in various ways covertly in Syria, as we can, as I said, the Turks and the Israelis as well.
It'll be really interesting to watch. Now, I want to talk briefly about Germany because Chancellor Olaf Scholz faces a confidence vote in Parliament today. I have to say, having covered confidence votes or thought about confidence votes in Westminster, it does seem like the German process is a lot more organised than perhaps it is in the UK. Can you talk us through what we can expect from today, please?
Oh gosh, well, it's more organised in the sense that, and it's also not. You might argue that some of the ones you've covered at Westminster involve a rather undignified attempt by the PM or the government of the day to cling to power. And in fact, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, is actually sort of bringing this on himself. He knows that his government is finished. He's got fed up with trying to accommodate with his coalition partners and trying to make it work. So he's actually, as far as I understand, going to move this vote himself to send his government into oblivion. And I think that just recognizes a general view in German politics that he's gone as far as he can. There isn't any point carrying on with this. And the sooner they have an election in the hope of getting a rather clearer electoral mandate, the better. And so tomorrow, you've got Friedrich Merz, who is the guy most likely to succeed as Chancellor. So he's the leader of the Christian Democrats. He's going to launch his election platform tomorrow. And yeah, I mean, his party, the CDU, are doing pretty well in the polls. It is still the case, though, that it's going to be very hard for any single party to get a controlling majority or even a heavy preponderance of the seats in the German parliament. But it is widely expected that Merz will be the next chancellor and will form a coalition. But what we don't know until the election actually happens, which is not expected for a couple of months, is who his coalition partners might be. You know, might the Greens soldier on with him? Does he have to make a deal with the current chancellor's party, the left of centre, SPD, etc.? We don't know. But the likelihood is that he will get it and Germany will move back to the centre right.
And I also want to ask, finally, if I may, on Vladimir Putin, who's expected to hold his annual press conference this Thursday. This is always a fairly extraordinary event, which it feels like you can't miss if you're Russian. Do we think that you're going to get a mention of the conflict in Ukraine or not?
Oh, yes, I think almost certainly. Well, I mean, listen, as a stalwart of Westminster, can you imagine how many Westminster politicians or prime ministers, indeed, would like only to have to give an annual press conference? But this is a tradition. I mean, Putin often does another one at this meeting called the Valdai Club, which he did several weeks back. But yes, he sort of promises the very tame and bruised Russian media that he'll always do a press conference at the end of the year, and in some way to sort of pay them back for the fact that, you know, they've been held in abeyance for all that time. He will often go on for hours. These press conferences often last more than 3 hours.
Wow.
And his logic, or the Kremlin sort of line about these, is everyone can ask whatever they want. Well, you know, usually there are some limits, but it's widely expected that he will address the question of Ukraine. He's already said at that meeting I was referring to before, the Valdai Club, he's already said that he sort of takes the idea of having peace talks with Donald Trump seriously, that he's open to the conversation, that type of thing. And I think it's inevitable that people will ask him about that. I think it's also inevitable that people will ask him about the state of the Russian economy, because while it's true Russia's winning on the Ukrainian battlefield, and a lot of people would say, well, why make a deal when things are going the way you want anyway? There are very severe strains in the Russian economy, plummeting of the ruble recently, all sorts of issues with their foreign exchange now. A lot of people predicting that, in the middle of next year, the Russian economy will just basically tank, run out of money for federal spending. So there are some pretty big challenges there. And like in our own politics, the cost of living, inflation, and other aspects of that economic crisis are pretty painful for people. So doubtless he will get lots of questions on that.
It'll be fascinating to see how he approaches that. Thank you so much for joining us, Mark. And we've just had Philip write in saying, when the world feels like it's on fire, Mark is the voice of calm. He always makes the madness feel like we can understand it all. More Mark, exclamation mark. I think we can all agree with that. Thank you. That was Mark Gurman. You can hear him at this time every Monday, and you can read him in the Sunday Times every week